I'd like to read today a bit from another book that I haven't read from before. It's a book called Jazz by Rex Harris, and it was written in 1952, so it's quite an old book, and it could possibly be out of date. Things do get superseded, but it's touching on an aspect of jazz that we in the UK hardly ever think about. Though I think in the US it's a bit more to the forefront, a lot more to the forefront of people's thinking. So this is about, he's describing the history of jazz, and he's just been talking about Negroes being transplanted from the west coast of Africa, and this is about them in the United States, and particularly the southern United States. And this chapter 2, is called The Slave Code. It is a basic fact that the American Negro is descended from imported slaves and their descendants. It is also a basic fact that jazz is the music of the American Negro. It is seldom realized, however, how closely linked the classic jazz form is with the unwritten law of the American Slave Code. For it was the harshness of the code which produced the environment and conditions which combined to form the very cradle of jazz. This is not a claim of direct cause and effect, that because there was slavery, therefore jazz followed, but this is a claim of something very near it. The abominable degradation of a section of the human race, the West African Negro slaves, which took place in the southern states of the USA until 1865, struck the fundamental spark of incentive which gave birth to the first faint glimmerings of a new folk music. The impetus which created an original music form, original it had to be in the narrow and strictest sense of the word, because jazz developed in the space of a generation out of nothing. The influence of American slavery upon jazz may be compared with the influence of a concrete slab laid upon an acorn. For a time, growth is completely stifled. To all intents and purposes, there is no development whatsoever. Then a sledgehammer smashes the slab, and the first small tendril appears through a crack in the concrete. The seed is alive. It is able to make use of nourishment drawn from its surrounding element, and to grow lustily into a young oak, virile, strong, and independent. So with slavery. The callous slave owners of the South held their Negro vassals in a vice-like grip as effective as any concrete encasement, until the 1860s, when Lincoln swung the sledgehammer at the die-hard southern slave states, and after a few mighty blows gave in 1865 freedom to the seed of the Negro musical inspiration hitherto buried beneath the oppressive stone weight. A glance at the constitution of this oppressive weight would not be inappropriate at this juncture, for it is an all-important factor which explains many things which have been condensed into 4 fundamental aspects of jazz. A. Why it should have arisen in the southern states of the USA, and there alone. B. Why it should have been born just when it was, towards the end of the 19th century. C. Why it should build its structure upon the foundation of inspired improvisation. And D. Why so many sources of inspiration, whose influence could have been expected to be slight, should have had an unusually intense effect on the early hot music. The workings of the American Slave Code, the so-called legal relationship between this master and slave were based simply on the custom and tradition. Nevertheless, the most fiendish of laws were enacted, enforced by legal statutes, given solemn sanction to nothing less than the atrocities. Laws of every southern state were framed so that to make provisions for this legal relationship, which was inherently fallacious in that it defied the very existence of Christianity, the accepted religion of those states, accepting as it did the fact that there were two types of human being, the master type and the slave type. The slave owners, who relied on the forced cheap labour in their cotton and rice fields and sugar plantations in a broad fertile area stretching from Louisiana to Virginia, even as far north as Maryland, knew that there was only one way to keep the slaves in continual serfdom, and that was by a strict denial of every opportunity of social and mental advancement. The suppression of all education followed logically from this axiom, and what did not follow was the utter cruelty of a presumption which went much further, to acknowledge as inevitable that slaves should never be anything but slaves, and that their status should be reduced to that of animals. Indeed, it is difficult to justify a claim that the American Negro slaves were ever treated as well as animals. Sir John Hawkins himself could hardly have foreseen the extreme barbarity to which the victims of the movement which he founded were subjected. The slaves of the Greek and Roman empires and the ancient Germans were treated badly enough, but certain rights were accorded them, rights which went as far as granting the slave a peculium, a certain maximum of small personal possessions which were his own. He even got them, not even the master could claim to them, and this right, with other small privileges, was protected by law. Throughout the centuries which followed Roman domination, a period in which slavery was practiced in many lands, the custom of giving the slaves some small rights was an accepted fact, and it was probably recognized that it was not done on moral grounds, then it was justified on economic grounds. A slave would work better if contented, and if a small incentive would encourage greater effort, so much the better. After the mass enforced migration of Negro slaves to the New World, these assumptions still held good, and the slaves of the British, Dutch, French and Spanish West Indies were permitted a life which was at least tolerable, and even allowed a degree of emancipation and manumission, but not so in the southern United States. In the Civil Code of Louisiana, and this is a good quote, a slave is one who is in the power of a master to whom he belongs. The master may sell him, dispose of his person, his industry and his labour. He can do nothing, possess nothing, nor acquire anything but what must belong to his master. And in South Carolina, slaves shall be deemed, sold, taken, reputed, judged in law to be chattels personal in the hands of their owners and possessors, and their executors, administrators and assigns, to all intents, constructions and purposes whatsoever. Slaves were chattels. They were denied even the sensibilities of a brute animal, and this had become so much an accepted fact that Henry Clay, in an anti-abolitionist speech in the US Senate in 1839, based his argument on the fact that the abolition would annihilate $1,200 million worth of slave property. 200 years of legislation, he said, has sanctified and sanctioned Negro slaves as property. And property they indeed were. Like domestic animals, they were referred to as stock, or as being sound, A mature female slave was termed a breeder. There were slave-consuming states and slave-producing states. The issue of female slaves was considered the property of the owner, just like the foal of an owner's mare. At slave sales, Negro women were advertised for sale with children or separately as desired. An advertisement in the papers of Charleston, South Carolina, in 28th of September 1838 concerned a lot of 120 likely young Negroes of both sexes, mentions several small boys without their mothers. The slave could be mortgaged, he could be seized to pay off debts, he could even be pawned. He had no family rights. The Journal of the Life of John Woolman, a philanthropist and minister, mentions that they often part men from their wives by selling them far asunder, which is common when estates are sold by executors at vendure. Marriage was forbidden, for the slave could not make a contract. The concept of marriage vows was incompatible with the rigid theory of slave ownership. Stroud's sketch of the slave laws states, "A slave cannot even contract matrimony. The association which takes place among slaves is called marriage, being properly designated by the word contubernium, a relation which has no sanctity and to which no civil rights are attached. They had no relief in the case of adultery. They had no right to petition on any grounds whatsoever, because they were property." And the Act of 1740 in South Carolina, in case any person should wilfully cut out the tongue, put out the eye, castrate or cruelly scold, burn or deprive any slave of any limb or member, or shall inflict any cruel punishment other than by whipping or beating with a horsewhip, cow skin, switch or small stick, or by putting irons on, or confining or imprisoning such slave, every such person shall, for every such offence, forfeit the sum of £100 current money. That learning of any sort of education should be ruthlessly suppressed was obligatory to the system. No further comment need to be made on this aspect of the oppression than the following quotation from Mr. Berry in the House of Delegates of Virginia in 1832. "We have, as far as possible, closed every avenue by which the light may be entered their, the slaves, minds. If we could extinguish the capacity to see the light, our work would be completed. They would then be on the level of the beasts of the field, and we would be safe. I'm not certain that we would not do it, if we could find out the process, and that in the plea of necessity." The foregoing may have seemed an unnecessary long catalogue in a book not concerned primarily with slavery, but it is most essential to bring into correct perspective the degree of ruthless suppression which existed over the Negro slaves before abolition, for it is against this background of the denial of every form of culture and the refusal of the most elementary education that the southern states of the USA became the breeding ground for the music we have come to call jazz. The dedication of the abolition of the slave code determined the date of birth of jazz. The final emancipation of slaves took place in 1865, when the victorious North put an end to the basic causes of countless years of Negro misery and suffering under the lash of the white whip. It cannot be coincidental that jazz was the embryo stage just one generation after this date. 20 years after abolition, the Negro's musical aspirations had developed to a stage where he could beg, borrow, perhaps steal, even possibly buy a second-hand manufactured instrument, and with this cheap instrument at his disposal, untold possibilities offered themselves, and jazz suddenly flowered into being. Musical performances was now, for the first time, among American Negroes in the hands of men who had some sort of flimsy education, who had travelled a little of their own free will, who had had opportunities for absorbing fragments of other cultures and arts, who had been able to sing songs for pleasure, play simple instruments for pleasure, men, in fact, who had never known slavery. The third point about the importance of the abolition upon jazz is that it determined the degree of improvisation which was to become the foundation of jazz. Had the Negro before 1865 always been given, short of freedom, reasonable opportunities for education, however elementary, and opportunities for musical expression, religious or otherwise, it is highly probable that the development would have proceeded along more conventional lines. He would have fallen more in line with orthodoxy, his contribution to the field of music, whilst retaining, no doubt, elements of his own instinctive and time-honoured cultures, would have been no further divorce from Bach and Beethoven, for example, than is the music of Bartók and Stravinsky in the field of European classical music today. Finally, the fact that the development of the music form was beginning completely from nothing in 1865 meant that every available source of influence would have a much more marked effect. To continue this... First of all, were their own simple work songs, which had in the past helped them to pass the long hours of labour. There was the religious music of the churches, now freely open to all Negroes, the rhythms and the structures of the Spanish and French music of the Gulf of Mexico, the march music of brass bands, and the underlying it all, their instinctive aptitude and hereditary knowledge of rhythm. Like the starving man who eats ravenously and indiscriminately the first food offered him, the Negro clutched at every accessible source. At this stage of educational progress, he had no academic resources to draw upon, no knowledge of European classical form. Little wonder, then, that the local material played such a preponderant part in influencing the erection of the new musical structure, now known as jazz. And in this book is by Rex Harris. He places a strong emphasis on the early jazz, which he calls classic jazz, and his book ends with the big bands. And obviously bebop came from a totally different foundation. These were educated men, knowledgeable men, well practiced. I mean, they didn't have a very good lifestyle, but they weren't uneducated, and they knew the European traditions, and bebop, very different from classic jazz. Thank you.